The asphalt behind Milford Junction still lives somewhere beneath my ribs. Cold gravel. The smell of diesel and iron rails. I was 14 years old, standing in the dark with one bag at my feet, watching the only car I'd ever called home disappear around a bend like it had somewhere more important to be. My mother's parting words came through a window cracked 2 inches, just wide enough for her voice to escape. Let's see how far she gets on her own. My father never turned around. Both hands locked on the wheel, eyes forward, like the road ahead was the only thing in the world worth looking at. I kept waiting for the reverse lights to flash. For someone to blink first. They didn't. Welcome to Found My Way Back. I'm Cassidy. I'm 34 years old. And this is the story of the night my parents decided a gravel parking lot was a better place for me than their back seat, and what happened 20 years later when they showed up needing something only I could give. If anyone has ever punished you for surviving what they put you through, stay with me. Because this one's for you. People always want a dramatic reason, a crime that earns the verdict. There wasn't one. We were 3 hours from home after a family wedding when I made the mistake of rolling my eyes at my mother and saying she always made everything about herself. 8 words. That was the whole offense. A teenager's exasperation on a long drive home. My mother went silent the way a sky goes silent before a tornado. She told my father to take the next exit. He obeyed without a word. She turned in her seat, looked at me with eyes like locked doors, and told me I needed to learn what real life felt like without the cushion of family behind me. She called it a lesson. She called it love. She told me to get out. I actually believed it was a scare tactic. I climbed out because I always did what they said, and I stood there on the gravel with my duffel bag hugged to my chest, certain that any second the locks would click and the door would swing open. The engine idled. My mother said her line through the cracked window. Then the car eased out of the lot so slowly it almost looked casual, like they were leaving a grocery store parking spot. I watched those taillights shrink until they vanished. And then there was nothing but me, the cold, the tick of a station clock, and a dark I had absolutely no plan for. Nobody came back that night. I need you to sit inside that sentence for a moment, because for a long time I couldn't. Here's the part nobody in my family ever wanted told. I did everything right. I didn't wander. I didn't panic on the roadside. I walked into the station, found the ticket window, and told the man behind the glass, an older gentleman named Curtis, exactly what had happened. Flat voice, steady facts. My parents left. Here's their names. Here's the car. Curtis didn't doubt me for a second. Something in his face shifted when he saw mine, and he picked up the phone without hesitation. He kept talking to me in a low, measured voice while we waited, like he understood that silence was the last thing I needed. A county deputy arrived within the hour. She crouched down to meet my eyes, opened her notebook, and wrote down every detail I gave her, the wedding, the argument, the 2-inch window, my mother's words. She called my parents' number. It rang and rang. She left a message identifying herself and telling them their daughter was with county services and they needed to call back immediately. They didn't call back that night. She made a note of that, too. I didn't understand yet how much that small bureaucratic notation, parents did not respond, would one day matter. I only knew that a woman I'd never met believed me when the people who had known me my entire life had decided I was a problem to be discarded. The deputy asked if I had anywhere to go. I said no. That's when the door to the station swung open and a woman walked in, drying her hands on a dish towel, drawn by the squad car lights she'd spotted from across the lot. Her name was Miriam Holt, and she ran the short-order breakfast place that sat directly opposite the station like it had always been there. She was maybe 60, built like someone who'd spent decades on her feet, with reading glasses pushed up into silver hair and flour dusted on one sleeve. She listened to the deputy explain the situation. She looked at me for a long, measuring moment. Then she said I could sleep upstairs above the diner for the night, until things got sorted. The deputy knew her. Half the county did. So that's where I went. Miriam didn't hover over me or pity me, which was the only reason I could breathe in her presence. She set me up on a cot, left a glass of warm milk and a slice of pie on the bedside table, pointed down the hall to the bathroom, and said good night without fanfare. The next morning, she didn't tell me it was time to move on. She handed me an apron. You eat my food, you learn to clear a table. Something inside me loosened at that, because work I understood. Earning my keep I understood. Owing nobody a single favor I understood perfectly. One night became a week. A week became the rest of my growing up. I learned later that Miriam had lost a husband young and never had children, and that the apartment above her diner had been waiting quietly for someone who needed it. I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew that a stranger had given me a purpose and a pillow, while my own mother had given me gravel and darkness. It took about 3 weeks for the county's machinery to find its shape around my situation. A social worker named Beverly Marsh drove out to the diner to meet me. She was sharp-eyed and careful, and she carried a folder that already had pages in it. She told me she'd spoken to my parents. I asked what they'd said. She paused the way decent people do when they're about to hand you something heavy. They told the county I'd run away. They told the neighbors. They told the church. Anyone who asked her the same version. Their daughter had a wild streak, always ungrateful, took off one night without looking back. She ran off on her own. My mother had used almost those exact words to Beverly's face. Beverly had written them down. I remember the room going very still inside me. I was 14 years old, sitting in a vinyl diner booth, learning that my parents hadn't lost me. They had reinvented me. They'd turned their decision into my character flaw and handed it to anyone who'd listen. Beverly asked if I wanted to go home. She had to ask. I said no. I said it without crying, which seemed to surprise her. I have never once regretted it. The county arranged a formal kinship-style placement with Miriam. All of it documented. All of it legal. My parents signed the paperwork without a fight, which tells you more than any courtroom could. They didn't contest it. They didn't appeal it. They wanted the version of events where I was the one who left, and signing those papers let them keep it. Beverly gave me her business card before she left. She wrote my case number on the back in pencil. She said, if you ever need any of this, it's yours. It's your record. I put the card in a drawer and tried to let the whole town 3 hours away dissolve like fog. The years between 14 and 18 went by in grease and homework and the slow accumulation of competence. I bussed tables. Then I ran the dish station. Miriam taught me the griddle, and by 16 I could handle a Saturday breakfast rush without losing a single order. I got myself to school every morning and back to the diner every afternoon. I made the honor roll twice, partly out of spite, partly because the school library was warm and nobody asked me hard questions there. I never called home. They never called the diner. My case file stayed open with the county until I turned 18, and then a letter arrived saying it was administratively closed. No further action. That was the only official acknowledgement the world ever offered that anything had happened to me at all. I learned to need nobody, which sounds like strength, and for a long time I believed it was. I refused to let Miriam buy me a winter coat without paying her back from tips. I wouldn't accept a ride I could walk instead. If something in the kitchen broke at midnight, I fixed it myself rather than wake anyone for help in the morning. Miriam watched this pattern for years before she finally said one thing about it. She said, Cassidy, leaning on someone isn't the same as being left. I didn't believe her. I'd been left. I knew exactly how swiftly it happened. So I built a version of myself that could never be parked in a gravel lot again, a self that owed nothing, asked for nothing, and could survive a complete darkness without a single plan. It worked. It also cost me things I wouldn't inventory until much later. At 18, I wasn't counting losses. I was counting covers and tips and the years standing between me and the day a diner might somehow be mine. Miriam didn't gift it to me. We both would have found that offensive. When I was 26, she offered to sell me her stake on fair terms like I was any other serious buyer. I signed and paid every month without missing one. By 30, my name was on the deed, the loan, and the risk. Then I went to work on what the place could actually become. Miriam's diner had been a good, tired room for 3 decades. I made it a good, alive one. I kept every one of her pie recipes exactly as written, because some things you don't touch. But I refinished the floor, knocked out the back wall for natural light, and launched a Sunday brunch that pulled customers from 2 counties over. We grew from 40 covers on a busy afternoon to over 160. I hired a cook named Marco who could have worked anywhere more glamorous and stayed because I paid him fairly and actually listened. I brought on a floor manager named Teresa, a veteran in her 50s who ran service like a military operation and remembered every regular's standing order. The bell above the front door rang all day. Strangers who came in for the first time always said the same thing. They said it felt like home. They had no idea what that word had cost me or how far I'd walked from a gravel lot to earn the right to create it. I won't pretend the armor came without a price. By my early 30s I had a thriving business, a paid-down loan, and almost no one I let fully inside. I dated occasionally and ended things the moment a relationship started to feel like weight I'd have to carry, or worse, be carried by. I worked open to close most days because resting meant trusting the world not to collapse without me. Marco once told me gently that I treated asking for help like a moral failure. He wasn't wrong. The girl who'd been left had installed a simple rule: if you never need anyone, no one can ever drive away and leave you in the dark. So that was the life I'd built. A woman of 34 with a full diner, a chosen family of staff and regulars, a wall I'd reinforced for 20 years, and a peace I'd assembled one shift at a time. That peace was the thing worth protecting. Not the building. Not the account balance. The quiet. The knowledge that every person in my life was there because they actively chose to be, not because blood obligated them. Stay with me. Because that wall was about to receive a knock from the one direction I'd spent 20 years refusing to watch. Miriam died the winter I turned 33. Quietly, in her sleep, the way she would have wanted. The whole town came to the diner after the service because there was nowhere else that made sense. I cooked for nearly 200 people that day and never sat down once, because sitting down would have meant feeling it, and I wasn't ready to feel it. She left me almost nothing on paper. I'd already bought everything fair and square. But her attorney handed me an envelope and a small object wrapped in a kitchen towel. Inside the towel was a tin box, the kind that holds holiday cookies, dented at one corner, sealed with old tape. A note in Miriam's slanted handwriting was rubber-banded to the lid. For when you're ready. Not a moment before. I wasn't ready. I knew it the way you know a bruise before you press it. Whatever was inside that box had something to do with the gravel lot and the girl I'd been, and I had spent 20 years not pressing that bruise. So I set the tin on the high shelf in my apartment behind the good dishes and left it sealed. I grieved Miriam by working. I kept her pies on the menu. I kept her reading chair by the window. I kept her habit of comping the check when a young person came in looking adrift. But the tin sat up there, dented and patient, for the better part of a year. Some part of me believed that as long as it stayed closed, the past stayed where I'd put it, 3 hours and 20 years away. I should have known better. The past doesn't honor the private treaties you make with it. It only waits until you've built something worth coming back for. It started with a woman who came in for Sunday brunch alone, dressed for church, who kept looking at me 2 beats too long. When I came by to refill her coffee, she said my name like a question. Cassidy Brennan? My stomach dropped a floor. She said she knew my mother from their old church. Said they'd sung in the same choir for years. Said it warmly, like she was delivering good news. Then she said the thing that made the morning go cold. She told me what a shame it was, the way I'd run off so young and broken my poor mother's heart. Said my mother still asked the congregation to pray for her wayward daughter's return. The woman patted my hand. She genuinely believed she was being kind. I stood there holding a coffee pot in the diner I'd built from nothing, 3 hours and 20 years from that gravel lot, and understood that the lie had a full, breathing life back home. It had a choir. It had prayers. It had a grieving mother at the center of it. And that grieving mother was the woman who'd told the dark to keep me. I poured the coffee. My hand didn't shake. I thanked her and moved to the next table. But something old and cold woke up inside my chest that morning, something I'd sealed as carefully as Miriam had taped that tin. The story was still alive. And if the story was alive, then sooner or later the people living inside it were going to want their ending. The first phone call came 9 days later. Teresa took the message because I was on the line during a rush. She handed me the slip with a look I couldn't quite read. A woman had called asking for me by my full name. She'd left a number and one sentence. Tell her it's her sister Nora and it's important. I had not heard that name said aloud in 20 years. My sister Nora was 5 years older than me, the responsible one, the one our parents trusted. She'd been in the back seat of that car. I waited 2 days before calling back. When I did, Nora's voice was smooth, rehearsed. The cadence of someone who'd practiced this in the car mirror. She said it was wonderful to hear me. She said the family had thought about me every day. She said our mother wasn't well, and that life was short, and that family should be family no matter what happened in the past. Notice what she didn't say. She didn't say I'm sorry. She didn't say we left you. She didn't say the word station. She talked for 4 minutes about healing and forgiveness without once naming the thing that required forgiving. I'd run a restaurant for years. I knew a customer working up to a complaint they hadn't voiced yet. I knew the shape of a person circling an ask. So I kept my voice even and asked her plainly what she actually wanted. There was a pause, a real one, the kind that tells you the rehearsed material has run out. Then she gave it to me in pieces, the way someone hands you broken glass. Our father's kidneys were failing. Dialysis 3 days a week. The transplant list was years long. The family had all been tested. Nobody matched. A sibling or child was statistically the best remaining hope for a living donor. She didn't ask outright on that first call. She was too careful for that. She just made sure I understood the arithmetic. There was a need only blood could fill, and I was blood, and the clock was loud. After we hung up, I sat in Miriam's chair by the window for a long time. The clearest thing I felt wasn't anger. It was clarity. This was not a family that had spent 20 years missing me and finally gathered the courage to apologize. This was a family that had exhausted every other option and remembered they had a spare daughter. The prayers, the choir, the wayward girl story. It had all been the public performance. The private reality was a man on dialysis and a list of relatives to test. I was not being welcomed home. I was being inventoried for parts. And the worst part, the part that sat coldest inside me, was that some buried 14-year-old corner of myself still wanted to matter to them enough to say yes. That was the corner I didn't trust. That was the corner that had once stood on gravel watching taillights disappear and kept believing they'd loop back around. I want to be honest about what I chose next, because it would have been easy to simply go silent and never pick up again. I didn't do that. Not because I owed them anything, but because I don't make decisions blind. I sat with it for a week. I asked myself the hard question honestly. If my father was truly dying, did 20 years of silence mean I should let him go without at least examining the facts? I didn't have a clean answer. What I had instead was a steadier, colder instinct. The one Miriam had spent years trying to coax me toward. Before I let any of those people near the life I'd built, before I let them stand on my floor or touch my quiet, I needed to know exactly what was true. Not their version. Not my 14-year-old memory, which they'd spent 2 decades insisting I'd misremembered. The actual record. I had built my entire adult life on the belief that paper was safer than people. That a signed contract kept its word when nothing else did. Now that belief had somewhere to go. There was a report from that night. There was a deputy's signature. There was a social worker's file with my case number written in pencil on the back of a business card that had waited 20 years in a kitchen drawer like a fuse no one had lit. If they were going to come at me with a wayward daughter story dressed up as truth, I was not going to argue from memory and feeling. I was going to argue from the file. So I climbed the stairs to my apartment and reached behind the good dishes and took down the tin box. The tape had gone brittle. It split under my thumbnail with a small, dry sound, and I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs made that choice for me. On top was a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a train ticket stub, the return ticket I'd been clutching the night they left me, the one I had absolutely no memory of surrendering. Miriam must have slipped it from my coat that first week when I was too numb to track anything, and she'd held on to it for 2 decades. Under the stub was Beverly Marsh's business card, soft at the corners from age. My case number still legible in pencil on the back. And under that was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice, with my name on the front in Miriam's handwriting. My hands shook slightly opening it. She was never a woman of many words. She wrote that she'd loved me like the daughter she never got to have. She wrote that she'd held on to every scrap of paper connected to that night because she'd watched too many people get talked out of their own lived experience by people who could lie with a steady face and a warm smile. She wrote the line I'll carry as long as I live. Keep the proof, baby. People lie. Paper doesn't. I sat on that kitchen floor and cried for the first time about any of it. Not for the family who left me. For the woman who stayed, who saw me clearly enough to arm me for a day she knew was coming and didn't survive to witness. Then I dried my face. And I picked up the card. And I made a call I should have made years earlier. Beverly Marsh had retired. But the county office she'd worked for hadn't gone anywhere, and neither had my file. You have the right to your own records. A former youth in the system can request the case file built around her life. And anyone can request a copy of a police welfare report that named them as the subject. I called an attorney first, a calm, precise woman named Frances, because that's how I do things. I wanted everything clean and unimpeachable. Frances confirmed my rights, walked me through exactly which forms to file and which agencies held which documents, and told me to keep copies of everything I sent. So I did. I filed the request for my CPS file. I filed the request for the police welfare check report, with the date and county and agency clearly listed. I included the case number Miriam had saved in pencil, which made the clerk's job simple and made me sound like a woman who knew precisely what she was asking for, because by then I was. I paid the copying fees. I wrote the diner's address on the return line, the address of the place I'd built, 3 hours and 20 years from where everything started. Then I did the hardest thing a fiercely self-reliant person can do. I waited on other people to deliver something I couldn't control. I worked my shifts. I refilled coffee. I kept the bell ringing. Every afternoon when the mail arrived, I checked for a thick manila envelope with a county seal. For 2 weeks, it wasn't there. Then one Tuesday it was. I waited until after close to open it. I sat alone in a back booth, chairs stacked on the tables around me, one low light burning, and I slit the envelope with a butter knife. The police welfare check report came first. Reading it was strange, like reading about a stranger I happened to have been. There was the date, the time, 9:47 p.m., the name of the station, Curtis listed as the reporting party, the deputy's name and badge number. A clean, official summary of what a 14-year-old had told her, and it matched my memory so precisely I had to set it down for a moment. And then the line. The deputy had noted that she made multiple attempts to contact the minor's parents by phone, left a detailed message with her name and badge number, informed them their daughter was in county custody, and requested immediate callback. A follow-up entry, dated several days later, noted that upon finally reaching the parents, they declined to return for the minor and stated that the child had voluntarily left the family home. declined to return for the minor. In a deputy's handwriting. In an official county document. With a date and a signature. Not my memory. Not my version. The record. I opened the CPS file next and found Beverly's notes, including the sentence she'd written because my mother said it directly to her face, the one about me running off ungrateful, the one that had since traveled through a church choir and 2 decades of prayer requests. The lie and the truth, in the same envelope, in the county's own hand. I sat in that dim booth for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and heavier and more profound than triumph. I felt seen, 20 years late, by the only witnesses who'd had the sense to write it all down. The pressure escalated quickly once they sensed I wasn't rushing toward them. Nora called twice more, the warmth in her voice thinning a little each time. Then texts started arriving. Not just from her. My mother had obtained a number I didn't recognize and sent a message that read like a sermon, all about honoring your parents, the brevity of life, the mercy God extends to those who soften their hearts. Not one word about a parking lot. Not one word about a night in November 20 years ago. A sharper message arrived the following day, the composure slipping. She wrote that she'd raised me better than to abandon family when they needed her most. The specific irony of that sentence nearly knocked the breath from me. Nora tried a different approach. Said she'd hate for things to become unpleasant. Said the family was prepared to come in person if I kept avoiding them. She phrased it like a courtesy. She meant it as leverage. Here's the thing about threatening someone with the worst version of yourself when they've already survived it. It doesn't land the way you're hoping. I texted Nora back something short and plain. If they wanted to have a conversation, they could come to the diner on a Sunday morning in full daylight and we would talk in front of God and everybody. I meant it as a boundary. She read it as an invitation. We were both about to find out which of us had it right. I didn't choose the diner on a Sunday by accident. I chose it because it was mine, and because it was full. For 20 years my family had circulated their version of events in rooms I had never been in, to audiences who'd never heard from me. The choir, the neighborhood, the prayer chain. All of it happened on their ground, with their captive audience, and I had never once been present to put a single fact on the table. If they were going to come for me again, they were going to do it on my floor, in my light, surrounded by people who knew me as the woman who'd built this place from nothing, not as a cautionary tale someone's mother told. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I wasn't planning to scream or collapse or do anything I'd be ashamed of later. I'd watched my mother weaponize calmness my entire childhood, the art of being the most composed, righteous person in any room while systematically devastating everyone around her. I knew how that trick worked. And I knew how to dismantle it. The person who stays calm wins the room. I made 2 photocopies, the welfare check report and the relevant page from the CPS file. Just those 2 sheets. The date. The time. The line. I slid them into a plain manila folder. I didn't tell Marco or Teresa the full story, but I told Teresa that some family I wasn't close with might appear Sunday, that I'd handle it, and that I might need her nearby. Teresa, who'd done 2 tours in places that would rearrange your understanding of chaos, just nodded and said she'd keep the coffee coming and her eyes open. That was exactly what I needed. I had my ground, my witnesses, my proof, and 20 years of practice holding steady when someone tried to tell me I hadn't experienced what I'd experienced. If you've never had a chosen family, it's difficult to explain their value until the moment blood relatives try to take their place. The week before that Sunday, I moved through the diner with new eyes. There was Marco at the griddle, who'd shown up one afternoon for a shift and never given me a reason to regret keeping him. There was Teresa, who remembered every widower at the counter by name and knew exactly how they took their eggs. There were the regulars, old Henry with his black coffee and folded newspaper at 6 a.m., the Caldwell family and their 4 kids in their standing Sunday booth, the night shift nurses who came in for breakfast on their way to sleep. Not one of these people shared my blood. Every single one of them had chosen, day after day, to keep coming back. My parents had never understood that about me. I hadn't built a replacement for what they'd taken. I'd built something fundamentally different, a place where nobody got driven away. The lesson my mother intended to teach me was that I couldn't survive without them. What I had actually learned was how to build a home so real and solid that other people found their way to it. I didn't need to explain any of this to the regulars that week. I just felt the weight of everything I was standing on, and it steadied me. When you know what's under your feet, it takes considerably more to knock you down. Sunday came up the calendar the way storms approach the coast. Slow, then all at once. I slept badly Saturday night. But when I woke, I wasn't afraid. I was something better than fearless. I was prepared in exactly the way Miriam had told me I would be someday, with proof in hand and the patience to use it. Nora didn't wait for Sunday. She came alone on Saturday afternoon, the way scouts precede an army. I was wiping down the counter when the bell rang and a woman walked in. I recognized her instantly despite 20 years, our mother's mouth, our father's way of not quite holding eye contact. She stopped a few feet inside the entrance and scanned the full, bright, humming room I'd made. Something flickered across her face before she could suppress it. It looked like surprise. It may have been something close to shame. She'd expected, I think, to find me diminished. The story they'd been telling required me to be struggling. A girl who runs off ungrateful is supposed to end up small. Not at 160 cover Sunday brunch with her name on the deed. I poured her a coffee she hadn't asked for and sat across from her, because I'm a host before I'm anything else. She talked around the edges for a while, how impressive the place looked, how she always knew I was resourceful. Then, for just a fraction of a second, the scripted warmth stopped. She looked directly at me and said, "Cassidy, you really did all of this yourself?" It wasn't quite a question. For one breath, I saw the sister I might have had. The one who already knew what they'd done, who had spent 20 years not saying it. Then the breath ended. The script came back up over her eyes like a curtain. She said the family just wanted to put the past behind them. The past, as if it were a place we'd all departed together, rather than a lot she'd ridden away from and I'd been left standing in. I asked her to just say it. Whatever she'd driven all this distance to ask, she could ask it plainly, because I was an adult and could handle plain language. So she did. Dad needed a kidney. No family members had matched. The wait list was years. A sibling or child offered the best remaining odds for a living donor. She delivered it like she was presenting me an opportunity rather than an ultimatum. She said, "After everything, this is the one thing you can do for family." After everything. I held that phrase in the air between us for a long moment and considered all the weight she'd packed into it, all of it pointing in the wrong direction. Then Nora did the thing that settled how Sunday was going to go. She must have seen something shift in my expression, because she reached for the oldest instrument in the family toolkit. She said gently, almost tenderly, like she was reminding me of a shared understanding, "Cassidy, I know things were hard, and I know you ran off. But you can't punish a dying man for decisions you made when you were a teenager." There it was. 20 years later. In the diner I'd built from a parking lot. My own sister looked me in the face and told me I ran off. She believed it. Or she decided to believe it, because the truth would have required looking at what she'd allowed, and what she'd repeated to everyone since. I didn't correct her then. Not there, with no witnesses, where it would simply become her word against mine all over again. I told her I'd give them my answer in person, tomorrow, at the diner, with everyone present. She smiled like she'd won something. She had no idea she'd just identified exactly which lie I was going to bring receipts for. After Nora left, Teresa came over and refilled my coffee without being asked, her way of asking if I was all right. I told her the condensed version. The people arriving Sunday were the parents who'd left me at a train station at 14. They were back now because they needed something from my body. Teresa didn't gasp. She'd seen enough of the world to know it could be precisely that brutal. She set down the pot and said simply, "What do you need from me?" I told her the truth. I needed her to do nothing. I needed her to let it play out in the open, keep the regulars comfortable, and trust that I had it in hand. Asking Teresa to stand close and simply witness rather than intervene was the hardest version of asking for help I knew how to do. She understood that better than I expected. She said, "Sometimes the bravest thing is letting people see the truth arrive." I sat with that all evening. The temptation to be dramatic was real. To throw them out on sight, to say the cruelest accurate thing I could locate. But cruelty was their instrument, not mine. My mother's power had always been her performance of gracious calm over a core of ice. I wasn't going to dismantle that by exploding. I was going to dismantle it by being exactly what they'd told everyone I wasn't: composed, factual, right, with documentation to support every word. I went upstairs and set the plain folder on the table beside Miriam's reading chair. 2 sheets. A date. A time. A line. I looked at it for a long while. Then I went to bed. And for the first night in weeks, I slept straight through until morning. Before I slept, I did one more thing. In the long blue of the evening, I drove out to the hill behind the church, not my family's church, but the one in the town that had kept me, and stood at Miriam's grave. I brought no flowers. She'd considered cut flowers a waste of money better spent feeding someone. I just stood in the grass and talked to her. I told her I'd finally opened the box. I told her about the stub and the card and the letter, and what I understood now about what she'd been doing all those years, saving every scrap a frightened, numb 14-year-old couldn't think to preserve for herself. I told her about the kidney and the choir and the wayward daughter story that had been alive and well for 2 decades without my knowledge. Standing there, I made myself be honest about my own intentions. I wasn't going there to destroy my family. I wasn't going to drag everything into the light or weaponize my father's illness back at them. I was going to do one thing only. I was going to put the truth on the table in front of the people who'd been lied to, and let the lie die where it stood. What they chose to carry afterward was theirs. Miriam had written that paper doesn't lie. Standing on that hill, I understood the second half of what she'd meant. Paper doesn't lie, but it also doesn't gloat. It just sits there being true. That was all I was going to be. I drove back to the diner the long way, windows down, and the dark that had once terrified a 14-year-old was just the dark. Familiar and ordinary and mine to move through. Sunday opened bright, the way the good ones do. By 11 the brunch rush was in full motion. Every booth occupied. Henry at his counter stool with his coffee and paper. The Caldwell kids coloring on the paper placemats. The night nurses laughing over French toast. Marco commanding the griddle. Teresa moving the floor like a conductor. I worked the room exactly as I always did, refilling, chatting, clearing, because the worst thing I could have done was look like a woman bracing for something. I needed the room to be exactly what it always was. Real. Full. Mine. The bell rang 100 times that morning. Each time I registered it without looking up. Then, sometime around noon, it rang again. And I looked. Because some animal part of me knew. My father came through first. He was smaller than the man who lived in my memory, gray and deliberate in his movements, visibly unwell. My mother followed in her Sunday coat, chin elevated, scanning the room the way she scanned a congregation. Nora came last, eyes moving nervously. The 3 of them stopped just inside the doorway. 20 years contracted into the space of that threshold. The last time I had seen my mother's face, it had been framed in a car window, telling the dark to keep me. Here it was now in my doorway, performing warmth for a room full of strangers. I set down my coffee pot. I wiped my hands on my apron, the same style of apron Miriam had handed me at 14, and I walked across my own floor to meet them. My mother went to work on the room before I reached them. She opened her arms and said my name like a benediction, loud enough for the nearest tables. She told no one in particular and everyone present that she hadn't seen her baby girl in 20 years. That this was a day of healing. That God was merciful. A couple of regulars glanced over, softening the way people naturally do at the sight of a reunion. She reached for me and I let her embrace me, because making a scene at the door would only validate her narrative. She squeezed theatrically and touched dry eyes with her fingertips. My father stayed back, alternating between looking at the floor and looking at me. Nora stood off to one side like a person who'd lit something and was no longer sure of the length of the fuse. My mother kept narrating. She talked about prayers answered. She talked about family made whole. And then, smooth as anything, with half the front of the diner half listening, she arrived at the point wrapped in the language of love. She said now was our chance to be a family the way God intended, and that her husband needed all of them, including me. I watched 2 full tables of decent people begin to nod along, because she was genuinely skilled. She'd been doing this her entire adult life. I poured 4 coffees and invited everyone to sit down. I seated them in the large corner booth, the one with a direct sightline to the counter, where Henry and the nurses and half the room could see and hear without any special effort. Deliberate choice. I sat down across from them, hands folded on the table, and let the room settle back into its regular noise. My mother talked about how wonderful the place looked. She talked about always believing in me. She was rewriting 20 years in real time, constructing a story in which she'd been on my side all along. I let her finish. Then I set my coffee cup down and I said, in the quiet, carrying voice you develop after years of managing a full floor, before we discuss anything else, I think we should agree on what actually happened that night at the station. The word station dropped into the table like a stone into still water. My mother's smile stayed in place. Her eyes went flat. What do you mean, sweetheart? You ran off. We were devastated. Said it for the room as much as for me. Nora stared at her coffee. My father looked at me and something shifted in his face, something that wasn't a performance. I understand that's the version you've told, I said. And I know you've had 20 years to tell it to everyone who'd listen. But it was never just my word against yours. I reached down beside me and placed the plain folder on the table between the coffee cups. I opened it without drama, turned the first sheet so it faced them, and read from it clearly and without heat, the way you read a set of instructions. The date. The time. 9:47 p.m. The station name. The deputy's name and badge number. The summary of what a 14-year-old had reported. And then the line. The parents declined to return for the minor. I set the second sheet beside it, the relevant page from Beverly's CPS file, and I read my mother's own words back to her. The ones Beverly had written down the day my mother said them to a county social worker about her daughter running off ungrateful. The corner of the diner had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that spreads outward. I looked at my mother. I said the only thing that might have sounded cruel but was simply hers, return to sender. You told me to find my own way home. I gestured at the room around us. This is it. You're sitting in it. My voice never rose. It didn't need to. The paper was doing the talking, and paper doesn't lie, and it doesn't perform. It sits there being true in front of a room full of people who'd been about to feel sorry for entirely the wrong person. I folded my hands and waited. My mother broke the way ice breaks, suddenly, and with considerable noise. She shoved the report off the table. It drifted to the floor. Her voice climbed out of its Sunday register into something raw I hadn't heard since a parking lot in November 20 years ago. How dare you? And then the full script, ungrateful, always the victim, always dramatic, twisting a misunderstanding into a catastrophe to punish the people who loved her. Half standing, her coat sliding off one shoulder, the gracious mother performance evaporating like it had never existed. The regulars weren't softening anymore. Henry had set down his newspaper. The nurses watched with the flat, professional attention of women who have seen people reveal themselves under pressure. This is the thing about a performance of calm goodness. It functions only until someone applies enough pressure. Then the real face emerges. And everyone in the room sees it. My mother called me a liar over a county document with an official seal and a deputy's signature, in front of every person in that diner. And they all watched her do it. Nora had her hand pressed over her mouth. My father, who had not spoken once, reached slowly down and picked the fallen report up from the floor. He read it. I watched him read the line. I watched 20 years move across his face. He did not defend her. He did not say I was being dramatic. He held the paper and became very, very still while my mother stood over the table telling a room full of witnesses that the document in his hands was a lie. And the room she had come to win watched her become the thing she'd spent 2 decades calling me. I let her exhaust herself. You cannot argue someone out of a performance. You can only outlast it. When she finally stopped, breathing hard, looking at faces that were no longer with her, I gave them my answer. Calm. Final. In complete sentences so there could be no revision of it later. I said no. I would not be tested. I would not be a donor. I said why plainly. These people drove away from a 14-year-old girl and were notified that same night that she was alone and in county custody, and they chose not to come back. You don't get to abandon a child, spend 20 years telling everyone she's the one who left, and then arrive needing something from her body. The door was closed. It would stay closed. That was a boundary, not a punishment. I told them I genuinely hoped my father found a match. I said I'd send the name of an excellent transplant program if they wanted it, because wishing him well cost me nothing and wishing him harm would have cost me everything I'd built. I meant both of those things completely. That was when my father finally spoke. He looked up from the report. His voice cracked on the first syllable and steadied on the rest. He said, I should have turned around. 1 sentence. 6 words. 20 years too late. But true, completely, unmistakably true. I held that in the air for a moment. A true thing deserves acknowledgement. I nodded at him. I'm not made of stone. But I didn't take anything back. A genuine apology doesn't reverse what happened. It only tells you the person has finally found the honesty to see it. I let him have those words. They cost him something real, and that mattered. But the answer remained no. I stood up. There wasn't much left to do but open the door. So I did, held it the way I hold it for any customer at the end of their visit. Steady. Polite. No theater in it. My mother gathered her coat and her composure and swept out, muttering something to the air about ingratitude, in a room that had already stopped believing her. Nora paused in front of me. For a second I thought she might finally find the real words, the actual apology, but she didn't have it yet. So she just said my name once, very quietly, and followed our mother out into the Sunday afternoon. My father came last. He set the report down gently on the table, as though it were something fragile that deserved careful handling. He met my eyes. He didn't perform anything. He simply left. The bell rang behind them. The same bell that rings 100 times every day for people who make the choice to come back. And they were gone. 3 figures into the bright afternoon light. This time I was the one who stayed, standing on my own floor in my own warm, full, real place. The room didn't snap immediately back to normal. Henry gave me a small, careful nod over his coffee cup. One of the nurses caught my eye from across the diner and mouthed, "Are you okay?" I nodded back that I was. Teresa came by, squeezed my shoulder once with both hands, and returned to her tables without a word. Nobody made a production of it, which was the most generous thing they could possibly have done. But I knew, and they knew, that the wayward daughter story had just died in the only town where it might have eventually followed me. It didn't have a choir here. It had witnesses now. That was the only rewriting that needed to happen. The boundary held because I'd built it the same way I built everything, to last. They didn't come back. A few weeks later a short letter arrived from Nora, no return address, 3 careful paragraphs that still couldn't locate the word sorry. Only I hope you understand. We did what we thought was best. I read it once. I put it in the same drawer where Beverly Marsh's card had waited 20 years, not as a wound, as a record. Because I keep the proof now. All of it. I never heard whether my father found a match. I made my peace with not knowing. Wishing him well from a safe distance turned out to be exactly as far as my love could honestly reach without destroying itself, and that was enough. The diner kept humming. Marco made his food. Teresa ran her floor. Henry drank his black coffee and read his paper. The bell rang and rang. One quiet Tuesday morning before the rush, I took the train ticket stub and Beverly's soft-cornered business card and had them framed together, both of them behind glass, and hung them on the wall just beside the register where I'd see them every single day. Not to relive what happened. To remember that the truth survived. That a frightened girl made the right choices in the dark. That a kind woman with flower on her sleeve saved the proof. And that between the two of them, a 14-year-old who did everything right and a 60-year-old who knew to hold on to the evidence, they outlasted a lie that had a choir and 20 years of practice. People ask me sometimes what's in the little frame. I tell them it's a long story about finding your way home. Then I pour them a coffee in the home I built in the town that kept me, and I get back to work. Which is the most honest, happy ending I know how to give. If someone ever drives away and tells you to find your own way, believe them. Then go find it. Build it so solid and so true and so full of people who chose to be there that on the day they come looking for what they left behind, the door already belongs to you. That's where I'll leave you. In the warm middle of a place built from a gravel lot. The taillights. The tin box. The county report face up on the table. Let's see how she finds her way home. She found it. She built it. And she made sure the proof survived. Keep your receipts. Keep your peace. A boundary doesn't owe anyone an apology. If this reached you, pass it along to someone who needs it.